The bullet that killed Penelope Foster's husband missed her by 3 inches, and she had been watching doorways ever since. Vance Younger first noticed it in the Dusty Rose Saloon on a scorching afternoon in July 1876, when the new telegraph operator walked through the batwing doors and immediately positioned herself at the corner table with a clear view of both entrances. She sat down with her back pressed firmly against the wall, her green eyes scanning the room with the practiced wariness of someone who had learned that survival meant never being caught unaware. Most folks in Laredo, Texas would have written it off as peculiar behavior, maybe even madness brought on by the relentless heat that shimmered off the dirt streets and baked the adobe buildings until they glowed like embers. But Vance knew that look. He had seen it in the eyes of soldiers returning from the war between the states, in the faces of settlers who had survived Comanche raids, in his own reflection after his brother had been shot in the back by a card cheat in Abilene. He was nursing a whiskey at the bar when she entered, and something about the deliberate way she moved caught his attention. She was perhaps 24 or 25, with dark auburn hair pinned up in a practical bun that had started to come loose in the oppressive heat. Her dress was simple calico, faded blue with small white flowers, the kind worn by working women who could not afford silk or satin. But it was not her appearance that held his gaze. It was the way she checked every shadow, every occupied chair, every possible threat before she allowed herself to relax even a fraction. Vance was 27, tall and lean from years of hard riding, with sun-darkened skin and dark brown hair that curled at his collar. He had come to Laredo 3 months ago looking for work after his cattle drive had ended in disaster, when half the herd stampeded during a lightning storm. The ranch foreman job at the Double R had been a godsend, steady pay and a bunkhouse that did not leak when the rare rains came. He had been trying to rebuild his life, to put down roots somewhere that might feel like home. But watching this woman position herself like a chess piece on a board only she could see, he felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with the whiskey warming his belly. She ordered coffee from the barkeep, her voice low and clear, and pulled a small leather journal from her bag. The telegraph office was just across the street, and he had heard that the railroad company had hired a woman to run it, which was unusual but not unheard of in these parts where capable hands were valued more than convention. The previous operator had drunk himself to death, and apparently this Penelope Foster had come highly recommended from San Antonio, where she had worked for 3 years. Vance turned back to his drink, telling himself it was none of his business. But over the following weeks, he could not help but notice her. She appeared at the general store on Thursdays, always positioning herself where she could see who came and went. She attended Sunday services at the small whitewashed church, sitting in the last pew on the aisle. She took her meals at the boarding house where she rented a room, and even there, according to Mrs. Henderson who ran the establishment, Miss Foster always sat facing the dining room entrance. It was during a particularly brutal afternoon in August, when the temperature had climbed past 100 degrees, and tempers ran as hot as the weather, that Vance found himself in the telegraph office. He needed to send word to his mother in Missouri that he was well and would send money soon. Penelope was behind the counter, her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, a smudge of ink on her left cheek. The office was small, just one room with the telegraph equipment on a desk against the back wall, a counter separating the public area from the workspace, and a single window that looked out onto Main Street. She stood with her back to the wall even as she worked, he noticed. The telegraph key was positioned, so she did not have to turn away from the door. "Can I help you?" she asked, and there was a musical quality to her voice that surprised him, as though she had been a singer once in another life. "Need to send a telegram to Jefferson City, Missouri," he said, removing his hat. Sweat dampened his hairline, and he ran a hand through his hair self-consciously. She slid a form across the counter. "Write your message here. 10 cents a word." He composed a brief note while she waited, patient and still. When he handed it back, their fingers brushed, and he felt a jolt like touching a lightning rod. She pulled back quickly, her eyes widening, and for just a moment the careful mask she wore slipped, revealing something raw and frightened underneath. "I will send this right away," she said, her voice slightly breathless. "Should have a reply within a day or two if your mother responds promptly." "Thank you, Miss Foster," he said, and placed $2 silver on the counter. She made change with practiced efficiency, but he noticed her hands trembled slightly. "You work at the Double R Ranch, do you not?" "Yes, madam, foreman there, been in Laredo since April." "It is a good town," she said carefully. "Quiet." "Mostly," he agreed, "though we had some trouble last month when those drifters came through." Her face went pale, and her hand moved instinctively to her side, where he suspected she kept a Derringer or small pistol hidden in the folds of her skirt. "What kind of trouble?" "Nothing serious. Just some drunk cowboys shooting at bottles behind the livery. Sheriff Morgan sent them on their way before sunrise." He studied her face, saw the tension in her jaw. "You are safe here, Miss Foster. Sheriff keeps good order." "No place is truly safe," she said quietly, then seemed to catch herself. "I mean, one should always be cautious." "That is simple common sense." Vance wanted to press, to ask what had happened to make her so vigilant, but the walls were back up behind her eyes, and he knew he would get nothing more today. He settled his hat back on his head and tipped it politely. "Good afternoon, madam." That night, as he lay in his bunk listening to the other ranch hands snore and mutter in their sleep, Vance could not stop thinking about the way Penelope Foster had flinched when he mentioned gunfire, or the way she positioned herself in every room like a soldier expecting ambush. Something terrible had happened to her, something that had carved away her ability to trust the world. He started finding excuses to go into town more often. The ranch needed supplies, he told his boss. He needed to check on a saddle repair. He wanted to hear if there was any news on the telegraph about cattle prices in Kansas City. Each time, he made his way to the telegraph office, and each time, Penelope greeted him with cautious politeness that never quite warmed into friendliness. But he also started doing something else. When he entered the Dusty Rose for a drink after a long day, he chose a table against the wall where he could see the door. When he ate breakfast at the boarding house on Sundays, he took a seat that gave him a view of the entrance. When he stood talking with the other ranch hands on the street, he positioned himself so his back was never fully exposed. At first, it was unconscious, a protective instinct that had kicked in the moment he recognized the fear in her eyes. But as the weeks passed, and September brought slightly cooler temperatures and the promise of fall, it became deliberate. If she had to live in a world where danger could come from any direction, then he would stand watch too. Not because she had asked, but because something in him could not bear the thought of her facing those fears alone. She noticed, of course. Penelope Foster was far too observant not to see the change in his behavior. He caught her watching him one Sunday after church, her brow furrowed in confusion as he waited by the door until she had exited first, positioning himself so he could see anyone approaching from either direction down the street. "Mr. Younger," she said, shading her eyes against the bright morning sun, "you are behaving strangely." He felt heat rise in his cheeks that had nothing to do with the weather. "Just being cautious, madam. Like you said, common sense." She studied him for a long moment, and he could see her mind working, putting together pieces of a puzzle. "You have been watching me." "Not in a bad way," he said quickly. "I just noticed that you are careful, and I figured, well, being careful is not a bad habit to have." "Why?" The question was direct, almost challenging. Vance took a breath, choosing his words carefully. The street was busy with families heading home from services, and he did not want to have this conversation in public. "Could I walk you back to the boarding house?" "I would like to explain if you will let me." Suspicion flickered across her face, but after a moment she nodded. They walked side by side, maintaining a respectable distance, but Vance was intensely aware of every breath she took, every small movement. When they reached the boarding house, she paused on the porch steps. "Well," she prompted. "Something happened to you," he said gently. "Something that taught you to always watch your back. I do not need to know what it was, and I am not asking you to tell me. But I recognized it because I have seen that look before, in men who fought in the war, in people who survived things they should not have had to survive." He met her eyes, hoping she could see the sincerity in his own. "And I just thought, if you have to live like that, always watching, always waiting for the next bad thing, then maybe you should not have to do it alone." Her eyes filled with tears and she blinked rapidly, clearly fighting to maintain her composure. "You do not know me." "I would like to," he said simply. She looked away, her hands gripping the porch railing so tightly her knuckles went white. "I am not good company, Mr. Younger. I am broken in ways that do not mend." "We are all broken," he said, "just in different ways." For a long moment she said nothing. Then, so quietly he almost missed it, she whispered, "His name was Thomas. We were married for 2 years. He was a deputy in San Antonio, and one night he came home early because I had been feeling poorly. The men who broke into our house were not expecting him. They shot him in our kitchen while I hid behind the door. The bullet that killed him came through the wood and grazed my shoulder, 3 inches to the left, and I would have died too." Vance felt rage and sorrow war in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "I am so sorry." "They never caught the men who did it," she continued, staring out at the street. 4 months ago I could not stay in that house, could not stay in that city. I needed to go somewhere new, somewhere I could breathe again. But I cannot forget Mr. Younger. I cannot stop seeing that door, hearing the shots. I cannot trust that I am safe, not ever." "Then I will help you watch," he said, "for as long as you need." She turned to look at him, tears streaming down her cheeks now, and in her eyes he saw something crack open just a little. "Why would you do that?" "Because everyone deserves to feel safe," he said. "And because when I look at you, I see someone worth protecting." She laughed, a broken sound that was half sob. "You do not know me," she repeated. "Then let me learn," he said. Over the following weeks, something shifted between them. Penelope began to acknowledge his presence with more than polite courtesy. When he came to send telegrams, she would ask about his day, and he would tell her stories about the ranch, about ornery cattle and green horses, and the endless work of keeping thousands of acres running smoothly. She shared small pieces of her own life, carefully chosen details that painted a picture of the woman she had been before tragedy reshaped her. She had grown up in Tennessee, the daughter of a schoolteacher and a seamstress. She had learned telegraph operation from her father, who had worked for the railroad before moving his family west. She loved books, especially poetry, and had a weakness for lemon cake. She had wanted children once, had imagined a house full of laughter and noise. Now she could not imagine bringing a child into a world that felt so dangerous. Vance listened to every word, storing away these pieces of her like treasures. He told her about his own family, about growing up on a farm in Missouri with 4 siblings, about his brother Jacob, who had been shot down in a card game over $20 and a perceived slight, about how he had drifted for 2 years after that, unable to settle, unable to trust that good things could last. About how Laredo was his attempt to build something stable, something permanent. "We are both running from ghosts," she said one evening in late October as they sat on the porch of the boarding house. The air had finally cooled, and the sky was painted in shades of orange and purple as the sun set over the Rio Grande. "Maybe," he agreed. "Or maybe we are running toward something new." She smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes, and his heart stuttered in his chest. He wanted to kiss her, wanted to pull her close and promise that he would keep her safe from everything that haunted her. But he knew it was too soon. That trust was something she had to give freely, not something he could demand. As autumn deepened and the cottonwoods along the river turned gold, Vance and Penelope fell into a rhythm. He would stop by the telegraph office most days, sometimes with legitimate business, sometimes with flimsy excuses. She began to save interesting telegrams to share with him, the funny ones or the dramatic ones that read like stories. They took walks together on Sunday afternoons, always with her checking sight lines and exits and him doing the same, creating a shared language of caution that felt less like fear and more like partnership. The town noticed, of course. In a place as small as Laredo, nothing stayed secret for long. Mrs. Henderson began leaving an extra place at dinner when Vance came to call. The ranch hands teased him good-naturedly about the telegraph operator who had caught his eye. Sheriff Morgan, a gruff man in his 50s with more experience than tact, pulled him aside one day and said, "That Foster woman has been through hell. You treat her right, or you will answer to me." "I intend to treat her better than right," Vance replied. "I intend to treat her like she is the most precious thing in the world." The sheriff studied him, then nodded. "Good man." In November, a band of cattle rustlers hit ranches all along the Rio Grande, stealing livestock and causing chaos. The Double R lost 30 head of cattle in a midnight raid, and Vance spent 3 days tracking the thieves with a posse before they caught up with them near Eagle Pass. There was a brief, brutal firefight that left 2 rustlers dead and 1 captured. Vance took a bullet through his left arm, and though the wound was not serious, it bled heavily and hurt like the devil. When he rode back into Laredo, exhausted and in pain, the first place he went was the telegraph office. Penelope took one look at him, pale and swaying in the saddle, and rushed out from behind the counter. "You are hurt," she said, her voice sharp with fear. "Just a scratch," he managed, though the world was starting to tilt. She helped him down from his horse with surprising strength, supporting his weight as she called for help. Dr. Williams, whose office was 2 doors down, came running, and together they got Vance to the surgery. He drifted in and out of consciousness as the doctor cleaned and stitched the wound, but he was aware of Penelope's hand gripping his good arm, her presence a steady anchor in the pain. When he woke fully, it was evening, and he was lying on a cot in the boarding house. Penelope sat in a chair beside him, her face drawn with worry. When she saw his eyes open, relief flooded her features. "You are awake," she breathed. "How long?" His voice was hoarse. "A few hours. The doctor said you lost a fair amount of blood, but you will be fine with rest." Her hand still held his, he realized, and she showed no sign of letting go. "You stayed," he said wonderingly. "Of course I stayed." Her eyes were fierce now, bright with unshed tears. "You could have died, Vance. You could have been killed chasing those rustlers." It was the first time she had used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips made his chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with his injury. "I am sorry I scared you," he said softly. "You should be," she said, but there was no heat in it. "When I saw you ride and bleeding, I felt like my heart was being torn out of my chest. I thought I had lost you too, and I realized that somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I had let you in." I had let you matter. Penelope, he whispered, and tried to sit up. Pain lanced through his arm, and he gasped. Do not move, she commanded, but she leaned closer, her face inches from his. The doctor said you need to rest for at least a week. I do not want to rest, he said. I want to tell you that you matter to me too, more than matter. You are the first thing I think about when I wake up and the last thing I think about before I sleep. You are the reason I want to build something here, the reason I want to stay. Vance, she said, and her voice broke on his name. I love you, he said, because there was no point in hiding it anymore. No reason to hold back when life was so fragile and tomorrow was never guaranteed. I love the way you are brave even when you are terrified. I love the way you laugh when something genuinely surprises you. I love that you trust me enough to let me watch your back. I love you, Penelope Foster, and if you will let me, I want to spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to be afraid again. She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but she was smiling too, a brilliant, beautiful smile that transformed her entire face. I love you too, she whispered. I did not think I could love anyone again after Thomas, but you made me feel safe enough to try. You made me believe that maybe the world still has good things in it. He reached up with his good hand and cupped her cheek, and she leaned into his touch like a flower seeking sun. Will you marry me? She laughed, a sound of pure joy. You are asking me while lying injured in a boarding house. I am asking you because I cannot wait another moment, he said. But you do not have to answer now. You can take all the time you need. Yes, she said immediately. Yes, I will marry you, Vance Younger. I will marry you and build a life with you and learn to be brave again, because you taught me that being afraid does not mean being alone. He pulled her down gently, and she kissed him, soft and tentative at first, then deeper, with all the emotion they had been holding back for months. It tasted like salt from her tears and like hope, like the beginning of something neither of them had dared to believe was possible. They married in December, a small ceremony in the whitewashed church with most of the town in attendance. Penelope wore a dress of cream silk that Mrs. Henderson had helped her sew, and Vance wore his best suit, his arm still in a sling but healing well. Sheriff Morgan gave the bride away since her own father had passed years before, and Dr. Williams stood as Vance's best man. The preacher spoke about love and faith, and the courage it takes to open your heart after loss. And when Vance slipped the simple gold band onto Penelope's finger, she did not flinch, did not check the exits, did not look anywhere but into his eyes. They moved into a small house on the edge of town, a 2-room adobe with a good well and a view of the river. Vance continued working at the Double R, but he talked about saving money to buy land of his own, to start a small ranch where they could raise cattle and horses and maybe, someday, children. Penelope kept working at the telegraph office because the work gave her purpose and she was good at it. But she no longer ate lunch alone or jumped at every loud noise. She still never turned her back to a door, and Vance still positioned himself to watch entrances and exits, but it became less about fear and more about partnership, a shared understanding that they would protect each other and face the world together. In the spring of 1877, Penelope discovered she was pregnant. She told Vance on a warm April evening as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. For a moment, fear flickered across her face, the old terror that something so precious could be taken away. But Vance took her hands in his and said, "We will teach our child to be cautious but not afraid. We will show them that the world can be dangerous, but it is also full of beauty and love and people worth fighting for. And most importantly, we will teach them that they will never, ever have to face anything alone." She smiled through happy tears and kissed him, and in that moment, she felt something inside her unclench, a knot of grief and fear that had been wound tight for so long finally beginning to loosen. Their son was born in December, a healthy baby with Vance's dark hair and Penelope's green eyes. They named him Thomas Jacob, honoring both the man she had lost and the brother Vance still mourned. The baby was colicky and demanding, and those first few months were exhausting in ways neither of them had anticipated. But Penelope found that the sleepless nights and constant worry were different from the fear that had consumed her before. This was the worry of love, not the terror of trauma, and it felt like a kind of healing. Vance was a devoted father, changing diapers and walking the floor with the baby when he cried, singing old Missouri folk songs in his deep, slightly off-key voice. He built a cradle with his own hands, carefully sanding every edge smooth so there was no chance of splinters. He positioned it against the wall in their bedroom, where both of them could see the door. As Thomas grew into a toddler, curious and fearless in the way of small children, Penelope found herself slowly letting go of some of her vigilance. She still preferred to sit with her back to walls, still checked sight lines automatically, but she also learned to play with her son on the floor, to lose herself in the joy of watching him discover the world, to trust that Vance was watching when she could not. In 1879, Vance bought 200 acres of good grazing land northwest of town, using money he had saved and a loan from the bank that Sheriff Morgan personally vouched for. He left his position at the Double R and started building their own ranch, working from dawn until dusk to construct corrals and break horses and drive fence posts into the hard Texas earth. Penelope helped when she could, taking over the ranch's bookkeeping and correspondence while still working part-time at the telegraph office. They named it the Standing Guard Ranch, a private joke that made them both smile, and they hung a sign over the gate that Vance had carved himself. Their brand was a circle with a star in the center, representing how they had found each other in the chaos and made something stable and bright. Their daughter was born in the summer of 1880, a tiny thing with copper hair and lungs that could wake the dead. They named her Rose Marie, and Penelope discovered that loving a second child did not divide her heart, but expanded it, creating room for even more joy than she had thought possible. Thomas, now 3, was fascinated by his baby sister and insisted on helping with everything, though his help often created more work than it solved. Vance taught him to be gentle, to protect his sister, and Penelope watched her son learn the lessons of love and responsibility with a fierce pride that sometimes brought tears to her eyes. The ranch grew steadily, and by 1882 they had a modest herd of cattle and a reputation for raising quality horses. Vance hired 2 ranch hands, young men from town who needed work, and he treated them fairly, paying good wages and insisting they join the family for Sunday dinners. The house had been expanded, with 2 more rooms added for the children, and a larger kitchen where Penelope could cook the big meals that feeding a ranch required. She had finally given up her position at the telegraph office when Rose was born, and while she sometimes missed the work, she found fulfillment in building their ranch and raising their children. She taught Thomas his letters and numbers, read to both children every night, and slowly, gradually, allowed herself to believe that the life they had built was real and solid, and not something that would be ripped away without warning. There were hard moments, of course. In the spring of 1883, a tornado touched down 5 miles from their ranch, destroying a neighbor's home and killing their livestock. Penelope spent 2 days in a near panic, unable to eat or sleep, convinced that disaster was coming for them next. But Vance held her through the worst of it, reminding her that they had survived before and would survive again. That fear was natural but could not be allowed to steal the present. And slowly, she calmed, and the world righted itself, and she realized that she was stronger than she had given herself credit for. In 1885, when Thomas was 8 and Rose was 5, Penelope discovered she was pregnant again. This time, there was no fear, only joy and excitement. Their third child, a son they named William Vance, was born in February 1886, during a rare cold snap that brought frost to the mesquite trees and ice to the water troughs. Vance was 40 years old now, with silver threading through his dark hair and lines around his eyes from squinting into the sun, but he was strong and healthy, and he loved his life with a contentment he had never thought he would find. Penelope, at 33, had lost the haunted look that had drawn him to her all those years ago, though she still preferred to sit where she could see the door, and she still sometimes woke in the night reaching for him, needing the reassurance of his presence. But those moments were fewer now, and the nightmares that had plagued her in those early years had faded to rare occurrences. She had made peace with her past, not by forgetting it, but by accepting that Thomas's death and her survival were part of who she was, part of the story that had led her to Vance, and this life, and these beautiful children who filled their home with noise and laughter and love. The Standing Guard Ranch became known as one of the most successful small operations in Webb County, and Vance and Penelope were respected members of the community. They contributed to the church, helped neighbors in need, and raised their children to be kind and brave and aware of the world's dangers without being paralyzed by them. Thomas grew into a serious, thoughtful boy who loved books as much as horses, and Penelope saw echoes of her first husband in him sometimes, in the set of his jaw or the way he considered problems carefully before acting. But there was also so much of Vance in him, the steady reliability and the quiet strength, and she loved watching father and son work together, teaching each other and learning from each other. Rose was a whirlwind, fearless and bold, always climbing trees and racing her pony and demanding to know why she could not do everything her older brother could do. She had Penelope's quick mind and Vance's stubborn determination, and they both knew she would be a force to be reckoned with when she grew up. William, still a baby, was sweet-tempered and easy, content to be held and watch the world with wide, curious eyes. He had Vance's smile, and Penelope sometimes looked at him and felt her heart swell so large she thought it might burst. In the summer of 1889, when the children were old enough to understand, Penelope told them about Thomas, about the man who had been her first husband and who they would never meet, but who had been good and brave and deserving of remembrance. She told them about the night that changed everything and about how their father had helped her learn to live again. The children listened solemnly, and young Thomas, now 12 and perceptive beyond his years, said, "So that is why you always sit facing the door." "Yes," Penelope said. "It is a habit I learned when I needed it, and I have kept it because it makes me feel safe." "Papa does it too," Rose observed, and she was right. Vance, sitting beside his wife with William in his lap, always positioned himself to watch over his family. "We watch out for each other," Vance said. "That is what families do." "Will we always be safe?" Rose asked, and there was a child's need for certainty in her voice. Penelope and Vance exchanged a look, a whole conversation passing between them in that glance. Then Penelope said, "We cannot promise that nothing bad will ever happen. Life is unpredictable and sometimes scary things occur that we cannot control. But I can promise you this. Whatever comes, we will face it together. You will never have to be alone with your fear because we will always be watching, always protecting, always loving you." "And when you are grown," Vance added, You will be strong enough to watch out for yourselves and for the people you love. That is what your mother taught me. Being brave does not mean not being afraid. It means being afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway." The children seemed satisfied with this, and the conversation moved on to other things, but Penelope felt something settle in her chest, a final piece of healing clicking into place. She had survived the worst thing she could imagine, and she had come out the other side not unscathed, but whole in the ways that mattered. She had found love again, built a family, created a life full of purpose and joy. She still never turned her back to any door, and Vance still positioned himself to keep her safe. But it was no longer about trauma or fear. It was about love, about partnership, about two people who had found each other in the aftermath of loss and chosen to build something beautiful together. Years passed, measured in harvests and birthdays, in hot Texas summers and mild winters, in the daily rhythms of ranch life. Thomas grew tall and serious, taking on more responsibility as he prepared to one day take over the ranch. Rose, true to her nature, insisted on learning everything her brother learned, refusing to be left behind or treated differently because she was a girl. William developed a gift with horses, able to calm even the most skittish colt with patience and gentleness. In 1895, when Thomas was 18 and preparing to court a young woman from town, Penelope realized with a start that she was 43 years old and had been married to Vance for nearly 20 years. It seemed impossible that so much time had passed, that the terrified woman who had arrived in Laredo clutching her grief like armor had become this confident ranch wife, mother of 3, pillar of the community. But when she looked at Vance, now 48 with more silver than brown in his hair but still strong and vital, she saw the same love in his eyes that had been there from the beginning. He still watched over her, still positioned himself between her and potential danger, still made sure she felt safe and cherished and valued every single day. One evening in late October, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset after a long day of work, Vance took her hand and said, "Do you remember the first time I told you I loved you? You were half delirious from blood loss and lying in a boarding house," she said, smiling at the memory. "I meant every word," he said, "and I have meant it every day since. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Penelope. You took a drifting cowboy with nothing but grief and restlessness and gave him a reason to stay, a reason to build, a reason to believe in tomorrow. You did the same for me," she said softly. "You saw me at my most broken and did not try to fix me or tell me to get over it. You just stood beside me and helped me carry the weight until I was strong enough to carry it myself. You taught me that love does not have to be fearful, that I could open my heart without losing myself. We saved each other," he said, and kissed her hand. She leaned into him, her head on his shoulder, and together they watched the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold. Behind them, through the open windows, they could hear their children talking and laughing, the sounds of a home full of life and love. Penelope thought about the young woman she had been, arriving in Laredo with her back always to the wall and her eyes always on the exits. And she thought about the woman she had become, still cautious but no longer consumed by fear, still vigilant but no longer alone. She thought about the cowboy who had noticed her habits and instead of questioning them, had adopted them himself, who had chosen to stand guard with her, who had loved her enough to let her heal at her own pace. And she thought about the life they had built together, brick by brick, day by day, choice by choice. A life that honored the past without being imprisoned by it. A life that acknowledged danger without surrendering to it. A life full of love and laughter and the kind of deep, abiding partnership that only came from truly seeing another person and choosing them anyway. "I love you," she whispered into the gathering darkness. "I love you too," he said. "Always have, always will." And in that moment, with the stars beginning to emerge overhead and the warm Texas breeze carrying the scent of sage and mesquite, Penelope Foster Younger felt something she had not felt in the years since that terrible night in San Antonio. She felt complete. She felt whole. She felt safe. Not because the world was no longer dangerous, but because she no longer faced it alone. Not because bad things could never happen, but because she had learned that love and connection and family were worth the risk of loss. Not because she had forgotten her first husband or the trauma that had shaped her, but because she had honored that grief by choosing to live fully in spite of it. The Standing Guard Ranch thrived for generations, passed down from Thomas to his children and beyond, becoming a landmark in Webb County and a testament to what two people could build when they chose to face the world together. And though the story of how it began, of the telegraph operator who never turned her back to a door and the cowboy who started doing the same to keep her safe, became family legend, it never lost its power. Because at its heart, it was a story about love conquering fear, about partnership born from shared vigilance, about two wounded souls who found each other and chose to heal together. It was a story about how sometimes the greatest act of courage is not facing danger alone, but allowing someone else to stand beside you. It was a story about how the right person does not try to fix you or change you, but simply watches your back while you learn to be whole again. And most of all, it was a story with a happy ending, with love that lasted a lifetime and a family that flourished, and a legacy that endured long after Vance and Penelope had passed into memory. Forever remembered as the couple who taught generations what it meant to truly protect the ones you love.